Communities have certainly taken the center stage over the last few years, from online communities for shared interests or also challenges to business-based communities to build a stronger connection to the brand. But then, of course, also local communities to build a support system beyond the official establishment, that we don't have to rely on what's available from government, for example. And now we've seen so many changes, from having more generations, not only in the workplace, but in communities, to having more access to information and tech tools, which led to a digital first work of a way of living. So clearly, we've seen a lot more challenges and complexities. And the question is now, what is the future of communities? How can we actually build engagement through communication from one party involved to another? And this is exactly what we are discussing today, because it is a very hot topic. And I couldn't be more excited to be joined by somebody who is taking Communi-Gagement and community building to the next level, because our guest builds the bridge between government and local communities. And this is certainly a big undertaking. Elise Green is our guest today, and I cannot wait to dig into the topic of community engagement and anything in between. Now, Elise is the founder and chief problem solver of Assent Communication, and she clearly has to solve a lot of problems on the daily. Now, what is really interesting is her background, starting with law, connected it with communication, and now overlaid it with community engagement. And this is what we are going to unpack today. Elise, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks, Petra. Delighted. Thanks so much for having me.
As I said in the short intro, your background is fascinating and your specialization is even more fascinating, because building a community is a hard undertaking as it is, but throw in legal requirements and the whole government regulations, it's another level of complexity. I'm really curious, what got you inspired to get into this profession?
Well, I think, like life in general, it was definitely not a straight line. If I go back to myself as a child, I always had a passion and an interest in having a say. And my parents always used to ask us around the dinner table, I'm one of 3 children, and they would say, well, what's your point of view on X? And the X might be what we should do as a family, or, you know, what was happening in the news or something like that. So we were always encouraged to have a point of view. And we were also, strangely, probably for the 70s, encouraged to participate in the decision making. So we were asked, you know, what did you think about this or that, and what should we do? And of course, a lot of the time our points of view were not followed, but I guess it's always been in me to have a say, which is kind of what drove me eventually to get into the law. But initially I took a communications degree. I was very interested in that and worked in that for many years, both here and overseas. And then later in life, I had the experience in a personal world to realize how important and useful the rule of law is, and took on the law degree while I've been delivering communications and running Assent Communications. And it's just been brilliant. I absolutely came to value the rule of law even more, and an understanding of our human rights opportunities in Australia, and essentially the Constitution and the value and the role that plays, particularly in how government and communities operate. So, as I said, not a straight line, but a very personal journey. And where I am today is just very exciting because of the direction that government and communities are going in working together.
Absolutely. And I love your background because it explains a lot, because it's usually our drive to actually contribute and to use our belief system and our values in a commercial element. Now, when we started working together and did our brain strategy session, and we explored what you're actually doing, like, it took me a little while to actually understand it, because it's not something that you just walk in and you know, oh, this is a dentist, this is a marketing manager, this is, you know, whatever it might be. So let's get more into your actual specialization. Can you give us a bit of a practical example where your support actually makes the biggest difference and an impact?
Yeah, sure. So, and a lot of people, even my closest friends and family, find it hard to understand what we do. And essentially, the simple way of saying it is that we help government and communities talk to each other. And by way of practical example, if you think of the everyday project manager in a government office, whether it's federal, state, or local government, they have a specialization. So they're usually trained in environment, transport. They're very intelligent people, and they're very knowledgeable about those sorts of subjects. But in that role, they often have the job of having to go out to different communities to seek community input. But they themselves are not trained in, you know, how do they talk about that topic to communities in a way that the everyday person understands and cares about? And even more difficult, how do they engage with those individuals and those stakeholders who are most impacted by a particular project they might be doing, whether they're building a piece of infrastructure or dealing with a new law development? And how do they approach that community in a way that they build trust with those groups and ask for input that is going to go into that government service or planning? And then the final challenge that that sort of government role, that sort of officer has, is how do they convince a group of people, for example, landholders, to make changes in their own property and their own lives that are good for landholders, but also good for the community and the actual aim that that government officer is trying to achieve on behalf of the government. So you can see there that whilst they have a topic expert in their field of interest, they don't have that other field of communications, engagement and change. And that's where we come in to support them in learning how to do those things and achieve what they're trying to do for both government and community.
And this is such a crucial part, because in the end, whatever you're working in or on, it always comes down to communication. Like, you can be the best at what you do, but if the person who is actually in charge of making the decision or the call doesn't understand what you actually want them to do or what you're actually selling or offering, it doesn't go anywhere. Now, the question would be, why are communities so important? Like, what is the role that communities play these days? Why does this communication and this transition actually need to happen?
Well, I wonder if I could just go back a step by way of providing maybe a little bit more of a practical example in situ of a kind of project that people might experience if they're in the community or on the government side, because I think that's a great precursor to answering the question you just put out there. So if we think about one of our clients who's the owner of water infrastructure, for example, like dams and water treatment plants here in Queensland, and obviously that's a really essential service, and their challenge is convincing landholders who live on the rivers and creeks nearby to manage their land in the way that doesn't get any dirt or fertilizer or pathogens, i.e. animal waste, into the water, so that they, the government entity, can deliver safe, reliable drinking water, which is what they're legislated to do. So in that situation, we work with the client and the environment groups that they're connected to help form relationships between the environment group, the government and the landholder. And in order to convince those landholders at the end of the day of what are the benefits of managing their property in a certain way to stop, pathogens and dirt getting into the waterway, and what does it mean for them as an individual in their local community? For example, if that particular landholder would be looking to communicate to them or help them understand, hey, if I look after my property in this way and I keep all the dirt or different ways that dirt can get into the waterway on my land, I can actually make my land more profitable. But then if the water's clearer, the natural environment in my local community is better. I can take my kids out in the river for a swim. I can enjoy barbecues by the lake or by the river. And then lastly, I feel proud, and this is what we concentrate on doing, on generate these kind of feelings for landholders or with landholders, that they feel proud of the work they're doing in protecting things like the local drinking water quality for the towns around them. So you can see there that in that practical example, there's a number of different steps that we would assist with. So we create the strategic communications message that explains all of this in a way that's interesting from the needs and interest of the landholder's perspective. Then we help in this case, the government client talk to the environment groups and help them work out how to develop these kind of conversations with landholders. And then we support that whole system, if you like, of relationships to come together and start to design government programs and services that will help deliver the ultimate aim, and that is protect drinking water quality. So you can see it's a very long sausage factory, but there's some very clear steps along the way. And that's something we call Communi-Gagement, which is our signature delivery of services.
And I'm glad that you took a step back and actually explained this example, because if we put it and overlay it with the corporate environment, it's exactly that. It's about setting the scene and having a strong vision, and then having buy-in from everyone who know what actually is required of them to contribute to the bigger goal. And this is also when you talk about, we want them to feel proud, because in the end, if you take responsibility and accountability over your actions, you think twice if you are going to litter, for example, or to not do the right thing in whatever way it is.
Model, yes, absolutely. In a corporate environment, I think the elements and of the process that we talk about, the community engagement process, remain the same. And you're absolutely right. It is about winning the hearts and minds of everybody in the chain, and everybody understanding the interrelationship of each other in achieving the common vision. And setting that common vision is right up front, whether, as you say, it's by a CEO themselves, or if it's a particular project manager who's trying to achieve a particular vision. So, and interestingly to me, I mean, I'm fascinated by the subject lots of different ways, but I think in this particular part of the topic is a lot of the things that we're trying to do are invisible to the eye. So we're trying to achieve trust. So achieve that trust between, say, in a corporate environment, the CEO and the project team, and then the project team and the customer, or the project team and the stakeholder, and to try and get everybody, well, on the same page with and understanding their relevant part to the whole is a real challenge, but it's one that we totally relish.
Absolutely, because in the end, communities or also teams, they are still a majority compared to leadership or to government. Like if you look at the physical ratio, the numbers ratio, it's 1 to many, or a few to a lot. And in the end, every single person contributes to an outcome. And if we can influence what we actually want as an outcome and have the buy-in, and people want to actually do it and they're not forced, or they do the opposite because they don't understand what's actually required, this is exactly how we can make change happen and work towards a common goal. Now, we talk a lot about the physical environment, the in-person communities, but at the same time, we live in a digital first world. What kind of role does digital play nowadays, and with the different generations, to connect with them?
Okay, well, I wonder if I could go back to the question you asked me before, because it leads into digital, and it'll kind of make my response around digital a bit more, I guess, relevant for anyone listening. So when you ask me how to define the role of communities in today's landscape, and when I say communities, we could be talking in a corporate environment just about stakeholders, stakeholder groups, etc. So for us, we take the lens of communities in government decision making, and so that is communities who, in any government department, might approach to ask their feedback or input into things like a project, like a policy design, or even the design of government services. In today's landscape, what that means is that when government approaches a group of people, like a town or a group of landholders near a project, or a group of people who are going to be affected by a policy, like, for example, even like a dog enforcement policy in a local area, or a group of people who are going to be impacted and rely on each other in a disaster situation, for example, in floods and fire responses and things like that. What's happening now is that community is becoming the center of relevance for government planning. And so that means that government are more and more going to community to asking their opinion. And in the past, government would ask the opinion in a very sort of linear way, in a very surface level way. For example, you can name the park, but in the future, it's going to be about designing the park. Do we need the park? Where does the park go? What's the purpose of the park? So you can see that it's quite a shift. And what that means is communities are becoming absolutely center stage. And there's some very interesting things happening in the renewable energy space as well. That is a great example of this. And for example, what's happening in the renewable energy space is that you've got renewable energy providers who are going out into rural areas where there's landholders who are have agreed to have renewable energy infrastructure on their properties, and there's also developing government policy that says in certain situations those landholders and communities are going to get a lot of money. Now, what's happening in that space is that in the policy that government is designing is that the communities must be part of the conversation with the private entities and also with government about how that money is directed. So you can see there that communities are absolutely becoming central and very powerful in being able to direct things like funds that are going to come into their own little town, even smaller neighborhood area if you're thinking about it in an urban environment. And in my view, that does put a responsibility on communities to do a couple of things. Firstly, people need to start to think about getting involved to be active citizens. So that means, taking the time when they see a project like this that impacts them to actually listen to what that's about, to read the materials, to, understand the questions being asked them and respond in a genuine way. And secondly, and this is the second piece of the pie, particularly in our space of government and communities, that when government comes back to the community and says, hey, we heard you, this is how we heard, for example, in the renewable energy space, we heard that, you want to direct funds towards, kids in sport, and you want funds towards infrastructure upgrades in your local town, etc., then the community needs to pay attention to what they're hearing back and ask the government to show them how their input is the basis and the evidence of decision making. So I know that's a lot to get your head around, but what I'm trying to show in that example is that communities really are becoming absolutely centre stage for the future.
Absolutely. Now, there have been a lot of things that you covered in that aspect, but it certainly supports. No,
Very passionate. And I can come back to digital. So.
But you covered what role communities play in decision-making process. It's all about how can you allocate limited resources, maybe funds, people, technology, whatever it might be, to unlimited opportunities, because we could invest into everything and anywhere, but it's more about prioritizing what's important now and having this collective decision-making process. But yeah, speaking of the digital world now, what role does that play? Because especially the younger generations, they may not be as engaged in offline communities.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right about younger generations. But in general, and I certainly will come to that, but in terms of the role of digital, it's really interesting in the communication space how that plays out, because it's in different layers of the work that we do. So firstly, when in engagement in general between government and communities, government will often come to communities and say, when they ask for input about, how do we solve a particular problem, say, for example, how do we prepare for disasters, then often communities, and that be multiple community groups, think of people in a town hall coming together with the discussion, and it's everyone from your older neighbor next door to the young family down the street. So everyone comes with, different mindsets and experiences, but digital plays a really important role in the storytelling about what the scenarios are for the future. So we've got wonderful digital technology now where we can create immersive experiences where people can really get a sense of what can the future look like? If we as a community choose this pathway, it might look like this. Or if we as a community are faced with this challenge and the challenge is likely to look like this, and you can use different online and visual technologies to be doing that, virtual reality and such, you can really start to get people into the emotional place of having the information required to make valuable planning input decisions or even information. So that's really important. I would call that crafting stories to show future scenarios. The second element is that digital communication channels such as social media will continue to play a really critical role, both for government and communities, or in the corporate space, of course, customers and corporations. And in our world, what that looks like is that it's a channel for distributing information about the engagement opportunity. And there's often a lot to distribute, but in the social media sense, again, it's a storytelling tool. So what visuals are we talking about? And really giving people a sense of how is this going to impact your everyday life? So they're better informed to make decisions when it comes to having an input. And also it can often be used, social media, as an input tool from people responding to different polls and that sort of thing that are put forward, especially because different people in the community have different levels of access to technology and also different levels of capacity to communicate. So, digital offers us the opportunity to get people to react, say, for example, using visual post-it notes on a website or something like that. Digital is also important from a democratic point of view to hear other voices on issues. And for example, that would be where you've got a special interest group that might be like, they, particularly interested in a local town, like they might be, XYZ Livability Alliance, or they might be interested in a topic, like they might be ABC mass transit focus. But both of those entities, they have membership groups, and they use social media importantly to communicate their position on whatever the government issue or project is. So, and in my view, that plays a really important part, even though we do work most of the time for government, it plays a very important part for government to be listening. Hey, what's the community saying? And what are broader people who trust that organisation saying about that point of view? Because all of that should be taken into consideration. When it comes to
As,
younger, oh, sorry, go on.
no, you're right. You go for it.
When younger generations, so that's an interesting challenge, because now we're getting into, it's both a challenge for government and community groups, because how do we really hear the voice? And it's not just younger, it's generations, it's also other vulnerable groups. But particularly if you think about younger generations, our experience and research is that they're really hard to get motivated to be what we want, which is active citizens. 15-year-old sits around going, this is how I want government policy to look, in 10 or 15 years when I'm in charge. And in fact, of course, if you look at some of the social science around that generation and their profile, a lot of them are very distrustful of government, and rightly so, because of some of the choices that are being made around important things like climate change. But we have had some success in specifically getting engagement with those groups through things like TikTok, because obviously different methods of engagement and storytelling, and using something that's very visual. But face-to-face is still really crucial. This is across the board, but particularly with youth, because with youth, depending on, you're looking 13 to 18-year-old sort of age group, you still, in order to be in alliance with best practice, we have to get approval. So we can't be seen to be, going up at a skate park and signing people up to give us their point of view without having a way for their parents to give approval. So the digital channels are vital to engage and communicate, but they also, we still have the challenges of everyday life.
Well, there's definitely a lot of challenges and a lot of moving parts to actually get to the outcome.
Absolutely.
And this is why people like yourself actually do that work, because when we talk about, well, you need to strongly communicate what actually the point is, it sounds easier than it actually is, because knowing what resonates with people, what evokes certain emotions, how do they best learn in terms of absorb information. You also mentioned a couple of times strong visuals take kind of the reins, because in the end it's quicker to absorb. We are on the go all the time, and it's also processed a lot quicker by our brain. So tapping into that power and leveraging the tools that we've got available now, it's just genius.
Well, that's very important. You're right.
It is, but when we talk about, say, governments or even organizations or boards, there's just so much external pressure to just keep the boat afloat, to not get sued, to tick the boxes in terms of governance. Thinking and acting beyond that realm, and thinking what's next in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years from now. You don't have the capacity to actually do that. So having the support that you provide is exactly what those organizations and entities need. Now, you also mentioned, it's quite hard to get the 15-year-olds on board, because YOLO, what's my input for 10 years? Nobody cares. What is what is the secret of success to actually build a sustainable and successful campaign long-term, and building the communities that don't fall apart after one initiative is ticked off?
Oh, sorry, could you restate that for me? I think I'm not
Of
quite
course.
sure.
So what are some of the success criteria, the principles for the strategies to build successful and also sustainable communities?
Okay, I wonder if I can answer that in two parts, because in my brain I kind of see them slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of a successful campaign, from our perspective, using our Communi-Gagement signature approach, we divide it into 3 areas. So one is create, and that's really about getting your story straight. And behind that sits things like looking at what's your context, what's your legislative context, what are your stakeholder contexts, and what is it that we really want your community or your stakeholders to do, and therefore working back from that, how do we put that narrative together? So that's vital. And sitting within that, it's one thing that's often overlooked is the very critical element of impact analysis, because it's one thing to sit down in a room with your colleagues of any kind and say, hey, how do we tell this story? But we find that doing an impact analysis of your issue really gives you extra information that helps you tell the story in a way that is most relevant and compelling to your audience. And the second part is really in the engaged space. And that's where we're looking at, okay, how are we going to define engagement? Are we saying we just want to inform people of something that's going on? Or are we actually saying to them, right at the other end of the spectrum, we're going to give you the power to work with us to co-design, whether it's a product, a service, a government policy. And that's a completely different type of engagement. And So it's making choices strategically around that, and what are the tools and methods that you're going to use to achieve that aim. And then the third part that's critical is thinking about change. What is it we're trying to change? What are we actually trying to move the needle on the dial here for? Do we want people to have more feeling of agency over their lives in a particular field? And that could be, again, anything from, say, health, personal health, maybe in the corporate space. You know, you might have some type of product or service that relates to that, and you want people to be more proactive around certain elements. So thinking about that. But in our world, in terms of government and communities, we're thinking always about what kind of change are you trying to create, and how do we sell that change? How do we make that change something that these people really want to engender? And the answer to that is kind of in the whole system, really, because it is about getting people involved to co-design the solution that you're trying to deliver. So that's what we see to be the critical ways and the success factors to make any kind of project that's dealing with some of the issues we're talking about successful. And yeah, go ahead, please.
No, you go. There's a second part.
I was going to go on to the second part of the question, but I can wait.
No, go for it now.
So in terms of successful communities, was that the second part of the question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's really interesting to me, because I don't know in Australia if a lot of people sit around thinking about what a successful community looks like. You know, I think part of our culture is, you know, we have the white history, which many of us, I think, are, you know, focus on first and foremost, and we start to think about mateship and, you know, our short white colonial history and the things that make up being a good neighbor. And then we, you know, we have probably something like the tall poppy syndrome, and we have lots of other things that influence our culture of what it takes to be a good community. And of course, that's just a narrow piece. You know, behind that, we have, you know, the First Nations culture of you know, beyond time, really, from my point of view, and what they bring to the table as part of the conversation. But the reason that I find it so interesting is that I think in relation to the future of communities to influence government decision making, is that a strong community, a healthy community, is one that really does take the role of being active citizens quite seriously. And that means, you know, they think about, you know, what's working in our place, in our field of interest. And that community group, as I said, might be geographically based. It might be a town who has, you know, I don't know, the local footy group might be the strongest community group in the town. And it might be that group that's taking the lead, or it might be several groups in the town joining together. But a successful community is one that really pays attention to what works for its local people. And it looks around and thinks, what do we need in this town? Like, say, for example, in our town, we have a very powerful range of community groups, and people are thinking about, what do we need in times of fire and flood? And what do we need when those storms hit? And there are things being set up in response to that. For example, you know, just a simple example is neighbours on streets agreeing that, you know, in certain scenarios, they'll go and check on each other, or in certain scenarios where there's an obvious issue with a piece of infrastructure, even, you know, electricity being damaged repeatedly, certain neighbours take it on responsibility to get together and go and see the council and explain exactly how the whole system works in a storm. I mean, that kind of approach is very proactive, and it takes, I think, not just the mindset of the individual, but critically the relationships between the people. And so a successful community is one that has relationships going in lots of different directions. And that would mean it's not just you and I that live on the same street that are friends. It's us also knowing people on the street on the other side of the town, or people on the street who maybe are in the caravan park living there. So it's a really interesting story, and one that is kind of a jumping off point for a bit more of a conversation. But when it comes to influencing government decision-making, communities that are strong, that do know the problems, that want to establish community-led solutions, are going to have a lot of power in the future, because that's exactly where government is going in terms of its policy and strategy design for delivery of services.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned, you know, obviously this is what success looks like, but how do you measure? Because you also mentioned you're basically selling and establishing trust. It's very intangible. What ways are you approaching, or how can you measure the impact of Communi-Gagement that you know it's on the right track?
Yes, and it's really tricky. I think always with communications and then engagement and then even behavior change, those three areas are, really tricky to measure. But in very simple terms, if we look at the engagement space, it's really about being able to measure the engagement level. And for us, that means what is the depth of commitment a community and individuals within it that we're engaging with has toward being positively involved in whatever the project or issue is. So that means in terms of a method to measure that, it can be, it's always a range of measures because it's a sort of a social science qualitative space. So we might start with a baseline attitudinal survey that's delivered by someone they trust. So it's someone they already have a relationship with, like, for example, a local community group. In many cases, we use local environment groups that already have relationships with landholders. We'll get them to deliver the attitudinal survey. And that gives us a baseline about what do people think about an issue, how willing or not are they to take positive action around that issue. And then 3 to 5 years later, we'll come back and see if we've been able to move that dial. But obviously there's a long stretch there, and there's lots of other things happening that we want to be measuring. So other ways of measurement that are really important is we use, it's like a pulse survey, but when we get to community groups together, we're asking them about their level, again, their engagement level, and that is specifically about what is their level of willingness to be involved in designing the solution of the issue or project that we're talking about. So we will use very simple poll type tools to be doing that. And obviously when we're reporting back, we're indicating, the method and giving, so that you've got a good understanding of the reliability of the data. But what that kind of pulse approach gives us is a bit of a litmus test. It's like a pub test. Do people think this is bullshit, or do they think it's actually genuine? And that's super important, because if you're in the first category, you've got all sorts of trouble. And if you're on the genuine category, which is where we're aiming to arrive, then you're building, as you say, that invisible trust. The third thing we do to measure is which I absolutely love because you get so many great stories, is you capture narrative. So as the engagement process is happening, we walk around and capture sentences, snippets of things and conversations that we're hearing, and we build those together to go with the other data. So that gives you the genuine feeling that is present in the room in different spaces and in different engagement moments. And of course, backing up all of that, you have output measures, how many people attended certain events and how are you on track with your messaging? Is it correct or not? But of course, the final measure is really, that 3 to 5 years later. And in some cases, I have to say, if these projects are much, much longer because they need to be, and because government has to have the long-term relationship with the community to continue to build that trust. But it's that attitudinal survey and going back and saying, hey, what did we create together and how do you feel about it? Are you actually doing the actions that you set out to do? And then one of the elements I also didn't mention, but very, I think, unique to this space, is that we're asking people along the way, how do you feel about the process? Do you feel empowered? Do you feel you're having your voice heard in a genuine way? And just really interesting to hear the comments come out from people, like, in some of the situations, you'll overhear, a landholder who might be an older male person who, is quite hard to establish a common bond with. And at the end of some of these get-togethers, they're saying things like, yeah, that's bloody good. Yeah, I feel like you heard what I said there. And that moment is where we go, oh, like, wow. It's so hard to create those moments, and you can see all the work that goes into it. But it's another important part of the measure.
I bet. And, given you're dealing with such a wide range of stakeholders, different ages, different backgrounds, but also different interests, and we throw in emotions, we're, all emotional creatures, behavior change, exactly. And then all the other external changes from technology and complexities and governance. There is just so much to deal with, and there are definitely challenges along the way. What kind of obstacles are you seeing on the journey, and what kind of examples have you worked through in previous projects?
Okay, so I mean, a great question, because I think anyone, whether in corporate or government, you've got these knotty problems and everyone sits around and talks to them and says, oh, what about that? And everyone goes, oh yeah, trust. I mean, the big one in government and communities, trust. They hate us, they don't trust us. And, you know, funnily enough, community also has a perspective on that, and we're doing research on that, but that's kind of probably another situation to talk about. But in regards to some of the challenges, one of the knotty problems is always community distrust of government. We know that generally, if you're looking at research in multiple areas, but particularly in the communications and engagement space, trust in government entities is declining. So you've got that context. And then if you go into a neighbourhood or any town, and as you said, you've got different individuals with different experiences, and they might hold a very strong view from a very important experience they've had, that you cannot trust government. And so when you've got a voice like that in the room, that can disrupt the level of trust across the rest of the group. So government trust is a really big part of the, a really big challenge, and something that we're always working on. And in terms of a solution, look, it's not an easy answer. The answer is in the 3 main steps of Communi-Gagement that we're talking about, getting those strategically right, because you've got to have a framework that fits together so that people know what is the vision and they're bought into the vision and they're committed to the vision. So that develops maybe a layer of trust. But then within that whole process, there's all these moments where you know, you as an organisation or individuals in the project are communicating about the project. And so each moment that you do is an opportunity to build trust. So that's about making sure your message is always on point, making sure you've got your the tone of your language correct for the vibe of the people that you're dealing with. But a very important part of that close the loop process and securing trust is coming back to the community after you've gathered their point of view and being brave enough to say, this is exactly what we did with it. And not only did we do this, but also pointing out we didn't do anything around these particular elements of the project or program, and saying why. And this is where, for me, it gets another layer of interesting, because this is where government says, hey, we're in a democracy. So you are part of the solution, but we have the final say on these particular issues for these reasons. And so that little kind of, those core steps are a really big part of managing trust, and you have to do that repeatedly. So as you say, it's a big juggling session, but you know, I guess that's part of the fun. And it's really about continuing to reinforce that you are genuine, that you are reliable as a project, as an entity, as a project officer. Another big challenge linked with trust, and I think probably interlinked, because as people can hear, these processes are long-term processes, which means time and money. So, you know, that's a big challenge, because in the past, particularly in the government space, you know, or even perhaps in corporate, there's been a perspective that we'll go out and we'll just ask a question about this tiny part, you know, of what we're doing. But the expectation of our community is that greater involvement, and that expectation is growing all the time, whether it's a community group or any other stakeholder, because people are understanding that they have more power as an individual. And if they're not happy with this product or solution or a government service, they're going to get onto social media and make a song and dance about it. So communications is really used as almost a pushing tool on government to kind of say, or on entities, are you showing up here? Are you being genuine to what you said you were being genuine about? And that takes time and resource. So I think it's about companies and government making a commitment to identify really who are the communities that matter to them on the issues they care about, and how do they develop strong, genuine relationships over time with those, because that will make the investment worthwhile.
100%, and you're not getting bored anytime soon. Even how many balls you have to juggle, how many, you know, complexities you have to nod out, and the types of conversations to have. Like, it's not an easy undertaking. And, you know, this is also one of your strengths, that you can put yourself into all the different communities, the different heads, and wear them and see what's interesting for them. It's not about me, it's not about them, it's about us as a collective. And this is where your contribution is so vital. Now, as we wrap up the conversation, everyone is curious, what does 2024 and beyond has in store for us? Like, where do you see trends are going in terms of the government and community engagement piece?
Oh, well, I'm really excited, but I'm also kind of afraid because it is a lot of change. And I think, yeah, it's a lot of change for community, and it's a lot of change for people working in government, you know, project officers and managers and their leaders and the like. And, you know, we as human beings always find change challenging. But some of the highlights that we see from some of the research that we're doing with government engagers, and then also with community groups themselves, is that there's going to be a real need for both government and community to think differently of how they work together. So as I said, it's going to be important for people on both sides of the fence to start thinking about longer term relationships and genuine engagement. And that's on both sides of the fence. So from a community perspective, that means joining a particular community group that aligns with your needs or interests and doing what you can to be an active member of that group. And when it comes to engaging on government projects or the like, making sure that you come to that and you encourage others and your colleagues in that group to come to that with a collaborative mindset with government. I think one of the challenges that some groups and government faces is that some community groups become wanting to get their way using social media reputation damage tactics, you know, and that includes spreading misinformation, that includes actually using myths to try and hijack an engagement experience. Now, that kind of approach, whilst they might win a short-term gain, is not going to work in the future. What community groups really need to be thinking about is, how do we genuinely engage the process? How does the process work? And are we, as a group, coming forward with proactive situations and a collaborative mindset? And the same goes for the government teams, you know, from a project perspective. In the past, and even, you know, very much now and probably into the short-term future, any specialist area of government like infrastructure or environment or, you know, placemaking and design has in the past been able to have control over the majority of their work. And whereas the future looks like a big shift, and that is a shift towards a more open mindset of having community involved in the design process. So the research is showing that essentially what's going to work well, and that means avoiding challenges and roadblocks from community or stakeholders in the future, is if you get community involved in the design process. And so that is a big mindset shift in public life, or in, you know, public in the public service. And that's acknowledged as kind of field that's emerging, that there needs to be a new mindset emerging in that space. So that's something to keep on board if you're listening and you're in that space. You know, it's time to start looking for those signs around the workplace and getting information from internally as to, you know, where your department's going. I think you could take that same learning into corporate space and think about, you know, customer involvement, stakeholder involvement in product design and service design and things like that, and also needing collaborative mindset. The other thing that is for the future is, and again, quite new, I think, is for both government and community. And when I use those words, I'm actually talking about the people that sit behind them, because we use them as words and maybe conceptually think about them as entities, but in reality, they're just you and I. They're just, you know, hey, I work here on the Sunshine Coast, I work at Sunshine Coast Council, or I work at the state government and I go to the office in Brisbane, or I'm part of a community group and we meet every day in our local cafe, you know. So we're really talking about people. So it is about people in those two groups for us, really thinking about what democratic processes do we have to talk to each other. And that might be sound like a big leap to be even thinking, what is everyday democracy? You know, how is that relevant to me? Because perhaps that hasn't been part of our culture. But the simple version is the engagement process is a democratic process. And so to be thinking about an engagement opportunity where, you know, you might go to the government and say, as a group, you know, we want to take this community-led project and get funding from you, or from a government perspective, saying we want you involved in this design of this new dam or this new road or this new solution to crisis preparation in your town, and saying, okay, what are the actual tools we're going to use? Which engagement tools will you use? Will we use a survey? Will we use, and how will we set, that survey up? And will we make sure it's representative or not? And I mean, these are intricate things, but they're all linked to the element of democracy and how much say each of the two groups have in making a decision. And linked to that is going to be people, community and government, feeling comfortable in having discussions, genuine discussions around who has the power. And And that will be the answer to that will be different depending on the project or service. So in some areas, perhaps like public health, perhaps some parts of road infrastructure, the power will clearly sit, excuse me, with government, because it has to, because it's linked to a whole lot of legislative triggers, if you like, that cannot be given over to community. But in other spaces, like perhaps, you know, as I've said, I guess a couple of times today, in response to crisis preparation, the power might sit with community, and might be 60-40. It might be the community saying, we feel that we need a local food system. We feel that we need a better flood response system, and we would like funding around these things. And this is how we use the funding. And the last change that we really see that is, you know, perhaps a step further along and might be a bit of a stretch in some people's mind, is when we think about those two groups working together, they are going to need perhaps a different type of organization, perhaps not a community group and not a government, but something that sits in between. So that, I don't know what that looks like yet, but what we're hearing in our research, it's a third party. So it's a third party project, whether it's a joint venture or it's a not-for-profit or whatever it is, but it's some kind of third party that brings to it a new sort of governance style that suits our type of legislation and the way we operate from a democratic perspective, and also suits this kind of collaborative approach to design and delivery of services. So that's what we're seeing, which is big for us and exciting, but I think also it's going to take some time for those two groups to get their head around.
Absolutely. But this is also where you play a big role to actually research what's going on, to translate, and then also to bring those parties together. Now, anyone who is interested and wants to explore it further, what's the best way to stay in touch with you? You also do your own research on those topics. You've got amazing networks. What's the best way to learn more about you, connect with you, and yeah, stay in touch?
I think the best way is probably through LinkedIn, just to get in touch and just arrange a chat. We, you know, always love to problem solve, and always happy to have those initial conversations via Zoom or what have you, and see if there's a mutual need or interest. In regards to the research, we are working with that. This year will be a big year for research around the law and what kind of legislation might be relevant to some of the future solutions that are needed. And I think towards the end of the year, we'll have some data to share. So keep a lookout for that. And also on the LinkedIn profile, you will see from time to time, we run short webinars for just half an hour to share the highlights of our research. So just to sign up for those. And if you can't see them, just get in touch and we'll make those available for free for you.
Oh, lovely. Now, honestly, this conversation has been fascinating. There's so many complexities and intricacies, and I'm glad that you're looking after that because somebody has to. Now, thank you so much for sharing all your insights, your learnings, and your wisdom with us. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.